So today's question is, disaster prevention necessitates a proactive and all-encompassing strategy to minimize the likelihood of disaster. So this question is from disaster management, and that is from GS paper 3. What the question is asking, that disaster prevention necessitates a proactive and all-encompassing strategy to minimize the likelihood of disaster. Now, before going to the main answer part, I would like to discuss the most important part of any question answering with respect to disaster management. See, this one means if a disaster happens, or if a disaster is going to happen, what we have to prepare, what and how we have to prepare ourselves. So before a disaster, we have mitigation and preparedness approaches. So we have, before a disaster, we must adopt mitigation technologies or mitigation procedures and preparedness. Then during a disaster response and after a disaster recovery. So mitigation means develop preventive laws and regulations, implement advanced codes and standards, establish zoning requirements, by insurance, construct barriers. So mitigation means if the disaster happens, then what you will do, and also means how, if a disaster, we know about that disaster might happen, then how we can prevent it actually, or you can say how we can prevent ourselves to means going through a great loss. So that is mitigation, right? Developing preventive laws and regulation. Then preparedness. Now, after mitigation, we have to prepare ourselves for that disaster. Now, for that, stock disaster supplies kit, develop manual aid agreements and plans, train response personnel and concerned citizens, prepare shelters and backup facilities. This one is also very important. Prepare shelters and backup facilities. We know that in Orissa, or in that coastal region of Bengal, frequently these cyclones are actually happening there and causing a great damage to the people's and properties and their lives also living in that coastal side. So in such cases, that those people already know that that is going to happen in any way, because we cannot stop the nature, right? Until and unless it is man-made. Now, in such cases, they prepare themselves with some necessities like shelter house. So cyclone shelter house is there in Orissa. So that is what I was talking about, that stock disasters and suppliers kits, develop mutual aid agreements, plan and train response personnel and concerned citizen, and prepare shelters and backup facilities. Now, during a disaster is happening, what will be our concern is the response, search and rescue to identify affected people, assess initial damage, then provide first aid and humanitarian assistance that we already prepared with from the preparedness, right? Then open and manage the shelters. That is the response. Then recovery means debris removal, means after the disaster happens, then this one will come, recovery. Debris removal, precise damage assessment, infrastructure destruction and reconstruction, restore the livelihood and community development. So I hope mitigation and preparedness, response and recovery is clear to you. Mitigation and preparedness before a disaster happens, during a disaster response, and after a disaster recovery. So a disaster is a result of natural or man-made causes that leads to certain disruption of normal life and property, to an extent that available social and economic protection mechanisms are inadequate to cope. Now, it is an undesirable occurrence resulting from the forces that are largely outside human control. We cannot control it. It strikes quickly with little or no warning and requires major efforts in providing statutory emergency services. Now let's talk about India's vulnerability profile. We know about India's vulnerable condition with respect to natural hazards. Like, we mostly encounter with, or we mostly being struggle with flood, earthquake, and then cyclone, these things. Now, so India's vulnerability profile will speak about that. India is vulnerable and in varying degrees to a large number of disasters. Around 59%. Remember, around 59% of the landmass is prone to the earthquake of moderate to a very high intensity. Even in the news, you can see that just 2-3 days back in Gujarat and the near around areas like Delhi and those regions, earthquake is felt, right? So India is vulnerable to earthquake, and around 59% of Indian landmass is prone to earthquake of moderate to very high intensity. Then after earthquake, flood is the next disaster you can talk about. About 12% of its land prone to floods and river erosions. About 12%, just like 59% of landmass prone to earthquake. Similarly, we can find out this data. About 12% of its land prone to flood and river erosions. Now, close to 5,700 kilometers out of 7,516 16 kilometers, actually 7,516 kilometers of long coastline is prone to cyclones and tsunamis. So 7 out of 7,516, 5,700 kilometer to coastal line to cyclone বা tsunami পৰা আসলতে সাফাৰ হ'বলগীয়া হয়. So we have seen that after this flood, we have another kind of disaster like drought. 68% of the cultivable area is vulnerable to drought, and the hilly areas are at risk of landslide and avalanches. Moreover, India is also vulnerable to chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear emergencies and other man-made disasters. These are the man-made disasters. Disaster risks in India are compounded by increasing vulnerabilities related to changing demographics and socio-economic conditions, unplanned urbanization, development within high-risk zones, environmental degradation, climate change, geological hazards, epidemics, and pandemics. So these are the problems, or you can say disaster risks with respect to India. Now, clearly, all this contribute to a situation where disasters seriously threaten India's economy, its population, and sustainable development. Let's talk about the impact of disaster. Disaster impacts individuals physically through loss of life, injury, health, disability, as well as psychologically also. So both physically and psychologically, an individual getting impacted by natural disasters, or you can say disaster. Disaster results huge economic loss due to destruction of property, human settlements, and infrastructure, etc. Then disaster can alter the natural environment, loss of habitat to many plants and animals, and cause ecological stress that can result in biodiversity loss. So biodiversity loss is one more concern of disaster. Then after natural disaster, food and other natural resources like water often becomes scarce, resulting into food and water scarcity. So after natural disaster, food and water scarcity is a common problem. Then disaster results displacement of people. Displaced population often face several challenges in new settlements, and in this process, poorer becomes more poor. So displacement of people happens after results. Then disaster increases the level of vulnerability and hence multiply the effects of disaster. So when vulnerability level increases, obviously that will imply the damages impact or the extent of the damage will be more higher. Then prevention and preparedness. Disaster risk reduction is the concept of practice of reducing disaster risks through systematic approach to analyze and reduce the causal factors of disaster. Pre-disaster risk reduction includes, like, mitigation and preparedness. We already talked about. Mitigation means to eliminate or reduce the impacts and risks of hazards. So proactive measures taken before an emergency or disaster occurs. So if an disaster occurs, then what will be the possible ways to reduce the impact or risks of hazards? Then preparedness means to take steps to prepare and to reduce the effects of disasters. So আমি দেখিলো mitigation means to work on the prevention of getting affected in disaster or less affected in disaster. And preparedness means to take steps to prepare and reduce the effects of disaster. Then post-disaster risk reduction includes rescue, providing warning, evacuation, search, rescue, providing immediate assistance, then relief or relief, to respond to communities who become victims of disaster, providing relief measures such as food packets, water, medicines, temporary accommodation, relief camps. Then recovery distance encompasses or emphasizes upon the recovery of victims of this disaster, recovery of damaged infrastructure, and repair of the damages caused. So recovery, we focus on recovery of the victims of the disaster, recovery of damaged infrastructure, and repair of the damages caused. So disaster management must be implemented at all levels of society and must have a bottom-up approach. Every disaster can be mitigated, and if there is a preparedness and risk reduction, then this should be the first step to reduce the impact of a disaster. So every disaster can be mitigated. See, we are not talking about stop, because this is a natural process. Sometimes man-made reason may be there, but this type of disaster cannot be stopped from human side if it is a natural calamity. So that's why we are talking about mitigation. So every disaster can be mitigated if there is a preparedness, and risk reduction should be the first step to reduce the impact of a disaster. এটা ডিজাস্টাৰক আমি মিটিগেট কৰিব পাৰিম যদি আমি অলৰেডি প্ৰিপেয়াৰ হৈ থাকো আৰু ৰিস্ক ৰিডাকশ্যন টেকনিক এডপ্ট কৰোঁ, যাৰ জৰিয়তে সেই ডিজাস্টাৰটো ইম্পেক্টটো কম কৰিব পাৰোঁ. So with this, we have discussed a very important question from, you can say, general question from the GS paper 3. And that are like 59% of landmass affected by earthquake, then 12% affected by flood, 5,700 out of 700, 516 kilometer coastline affected by cyclones, 68% by drought, 68% of cultivable area is vulnerable to drought. So this data we talk about along with disaster and some techniques before a disaster happens, like mitigation and preparedness, during a disaster response, and after a disaster. So I hope that this is sufficient for today. Thank you very much.